about sort of the early stages of your journey, how you became an attorney, how you then stepped into, Zen. And did those two things have anything to do with each other?
Yeah, well, probably sort of. How I became an attorney.
And you're a defense attorney.
I am criminal defense, public defender. So I represent those who cannot afford an attorney. I became an attorney because I was in graduate school in philosophy. And I was all but dissertation. My girlfriend was the same. And we sat there one day and said, if we write the big term paper, we'll basically be unemployable. So we should probably pick new gigs. And so it was decided one of us would go and study computer science and one would go to law school. And I literally don't know how we made the decision. But she went to computer science. She's very successful. She's made a lot of money and left me. I went to law school and I don't make much money. So that's how I became a lawyer. I had gone with, as most lawyers do, young lawyers do, with visions of, working for Microsoft or something. But I got a job with a local attorney in town who did a lot of criminal law. And before I graduated law school, I was allowed to actually try a case. And, standing in the middle of a room like this, where everybody has to listen to you for a few minutes, is kind of groovy. And so I've been doing it about 20 years now.
So talk a little bit about how that, and we talk about right livelihood. And I don't know, how do you see that fitting in with Zen practice? Or does not really come together for you?
I don't think I make a connection directly between the idea of right livelihood, so be a lawyer, or right livelihood, so do any particular thing. I practice law. Well, what I do in my practice of law is I basically deal with people who every time I meet with them, it is probably quite literally the worst day of their life. Even if I met with them the day before, today is worse because it's another day in jail, or it's another day with charges pending, or it's another day of them in fear that their life is falling apart. So I guess I don't think so much, I've just never been a person thought of what right livelihood has having anything to do with what your job is, so much as how do you think of your job and how do you approach it. So, I mean, that's one thing Zen has been for me, is helping me to understand this person is suffering. This is a bad day for them. So, that's what compassion is knowing that and saying, okay.
So, talking earlier, I know that your life has been flawless, and that's what brought you. No, tell us what brought you to Zen. Usually, there's some sort of turning point in one's life, and somehow we're introduced to this practice, and it allows us to benefit from those changes. But what was that for you?
I was trying to think about it on my way up here when I first came across Zen. And probably the first time I really knew what Zen was when I was an undergrad in philosophy. I had a teacher, David Morgan. He was a short, squat man from New York. He was Jewish, had been a freedom rider back in the day. Yeah, he taught logic and communist political theory, and a class called Confucianism, Taoism, and Zen. So I'd taken that, and I frankly was not all that impressed with Zen, but I like Taoism a lot. Fast forward, that was 18, 19 years old. Fast forward, I've now been a lawyer. Well, I went to graduate school, so I went to law school late. So about 10 years ago, a little bit more, I'm a hardcore alcoholic. I mean, screaming alcoholic. I'm married, I have a daughter, and I'm about to lose them both. I've been asked to leave my job. I was given the courtesy of resigning for medical reasons. The medical reasons was my blood alcohol level was way too high. And I was currently suspended from the practice of law. Not officially for the drinking, but because when someone complains, you have to answer, and I didn't answer. And I was in a hotel room, and I knew that things were really bad. And I think I've always lived my life. I've always lived my life from when I was very young, believing that there's got to be a way of living your life where I'm really trying hard not to swear. I apologize. So if I pause, it's because there's a swear word there. I was really trying to live my life. And I think there's got to be, it's like in law. How I proceeded in law as a lawyer, as a criminal defense attorney, is you're looking for that argument. If I can just come up with the argument and tell the jury the perfect argument, I can win the case. You can win every case if you can just find the right argument. And so I'm sitting there in a hotel room with my 100-pound black lab. You know, I always refer to it as you're hungover from the first drinks, but still drunk from the latter drinks, trying to figure out what am I going to do here? And that was running through my head, this idea of, I've always thought there's got to be a way, there's got to be a way, there's got to be a way. And then I sat there and went, crap. Down means the way. And I just sat there and thought about that. Down means the way. I kind of always known it. I've kind of always known there. So over the next 30 days or so, I roughly get myself together, stop drinking, pretty much cold turkey at that point, as close as I could without dying. Within 30 days, I was sober, and I went to the bookstore and started buying books on Buddhism and Taoism, and started going to AA meetings. Hated AA meetings. Hated them. I'm a believer in AA because I believe that when you're getting sober, you need something to do, and you need something to do every day. So I'm a big believer in it, but I wasn't connecting with it. But I would go and I would read my Buddhist and Taoist stuff. One of the first books that meant anything to me was called The Tao of Sobriety. And it was a Taoist 12-step approach. And that kind of, besides that, my life was perfect, though. But that's how I came to it. Eventually, I was very interested in Buddhist recovery programs. And a couple of the big ones out there, if you're not familiar, there's Noah Levine, who's sort of fallen from grace, unfortunately, but he had Against the Stream. And Kevin Griffin, One Breath at a Time, which is a great program, great book. I was very involved with those. I actually, before I even came here, I had started my own Buddhist recovery group, True Rebel Path. It was a hideously unsuccessful group that eventually was sort of taken over by one of the Unitarian churches, and is now still an ongoing operation. They made a go of it as just a normal Buddhist meditation group. Having left that, I met John, who was a member here for a long time, a Black Robe, and he ran a group in Kennesaw. and I started going to John. And John was great. John's a former addict. And so he got it. We connected immediately. And for a while, I attended with him. He moved on and sort of handed me the keys to that group. But we agreed I should probably come and meet Sensei before running sort of a little tiny mini affiliate. And that's how I came to be here.
Well, you came into this through Taoism. Initially, it sounded like maybe skeptical of Zen. How do you reconcile those two things, or are they two things?
I don't think they're two things. I really don't. For me, if anything, I think for me the Tao is, I want to say the intellectual part, but it's not really that. For me, the Tao is the mental attitude. And Zen for me is a practice. There's overlap, there's connections, of course, but for me, that's how I've always felt of it.
And talk a little bit about your Lutheran practice and how that has evolved, I guess, over the years, and in conjunction with, or I don't know, opposition to, or whatever it's done with Zen.
I was raised Lutheran, a very liberal Lutheran church. I think this is hilarious. Nobody ever laughs at it, but we met in the basement of a Boy Scout building. Thank you.
Okay, it's usually the other way around.
It's great church, very liberal. This would have been back in the late 60s, early 70s. They actually had a full Passover Seder every year. It was just...
You've told me a story I remember about, you're one that if there's a conversation going on, you're going to participate. And when you were a little kid, you would ask questions, and they took you aside. Tell that story, because I like the way they engaged you. It was different than my upbringing, which was more of a turnoff.
Really tells you how liberal my church was, and also how it totally screwed me up in life. And made me who I am. I mean, I really do think this is one of those seminal moments in your life. I used to ask questions all the time, and I'm a little kid, and I'm in Sunday school, right? And I'm sitting there, and they're talking about Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and they're all talking about this and explaining to all us little kids. And I may have been 5 or 6, and I started asking questions because something didn't add up. It didn't make sense to me, and so I'm asking questions. Now, I'm a kid who would raise my hand during church.
While they're giving the sermon.
Literally, we had guest pastor one time, and I raised my hand, and he said, "Oh, you're the one I heard about." Not kidding. What I asked him at that time was, if Jesus was nailed to the cross, if he's God, why did he die? God shouldn't die. But, which I was really asking about the Trinity. I was just a little kid version of it. Anyways, I'm in Sunday school, and they're talking about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And I'm asking questions. And finally, one of the teachers tells the other one, watch the class. Kevin, come with me. I remember this distinctly. We go out of the room and walk down what felt like a really long hall. Probably maybe 15 feet, but it felt like an eternity. We walk all the way down the hall, and she opens the door to another room. We go inside, she shuts it behind her, and then kneels down in front of me. Says, Kevin, the Garden of Eden is a metaphor. And I remember my brain just being like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. Well, that explains everything. And I think she talked some more about it, but it didn't matter to me. To me, it was like, oh, okay, I get this now. And then she took me out of the room and back down the hall, and we went back to Sunday school. So that's probably why some years later, when I was about 13, I remember coming home from church and saying to my parents, I don't think I'm going to go anymore, and I don't think you should either. And strangely enough, my parents said, no, that makes sense.
And you sat them down and told them it was a metaphor?
I literally, I don't think they went back. My parents didn't go back to a church for years.
So, but it's a meaningful part of your life, and I know you're very involved with your church now. Talk a little bit about that and what you're doing there. You know, I know you've got an interesting program coming up too.
I had not been involved with the church for a long time, and I was involved very regularly here at this center for about 9 years. I was thinking back because I didn't realize it had been that long, but I think I've been sober 10, a little more than 10. And I came here within the first year of sobriety. I said, I'm fearful of asking anybody here what I was like when I first came here, because I'm sure I was still pretty fragile. And for 9 years, I practiced here regularly. I was Doan, sort of, I don't know if it was ever official, but I remember one of my first times here, Sensei said to me, go study to be Doan. Go study with this guy. I said, okay. And I go to him. I said, told me to study to be Doan. And I said, okay. And that's the last time I saw him for years. Literally. So I'm coming every Sunday. I don't know what to do. So I made up Doan practice. I don't think Sensei probably knows that, but I just made up what I did. And it was quite elaborate. It's quite a beautiful.
That was the time of the funky rhythms. Yeah. I remember that.
Oh, I did. Well, I did. No, I did that once. That was. But I've been practicing for a while here, and I think I was starting to get. Well, I was running some small one-day retreats. First one was on Valentine's Day. So, and I did that a couple of years in a row, and it was always about the Heart Sutra on Valentine's Day, because I thought that was a really funny joke, which nobody else thought was a funny joke. But they were great, because I'd come in, and it would always start with David Bowie music. Drive-In Saturday was my theme song. And we'd have these retreats where I think they were interesting. I think they were appropriate. I think we did some really interesting work, but they were all crazy. But as time went on with those, I began looking in other areas for inspiration. And it's funny because I probably the person that first really started to draw me, ironically, back to practicing Lutheranism, is Jay Baker, who was the son of Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I don't know if you know. Totally groovy guy, right? He was a hardcore alcoholic. He got sober. He starts Revolution Church, which is one of the early fully inclusive churches. And he had been an evangelical darling, and he was shunned. And he really is a leader of what I call a post-evangelical movement, or was one of the early figures in it. Well, I started listening to a lot of these post-evangelicals and seeing the interesting things, how they were taking Christianity and trying to reconstruct it. And I realized I was doing some of that. I was trying to play with some of those ideas within Buddhism as well. And they were overlapping. Finally, we get to Easter of one year. And I have always been fascinated with the Easter story. And it used to be like a really awful, blasphemous joke in my head that I would make about how if Christ died on Friday, Saturday's a free day, which is completely inappropriate. I know, but that idea, even though it was a bad joke, I was always this idea of the disciples who have committed their lives. They've given up everything to follow this man who's going to change the world. And they come and they kill him like that. in between their belief that he's going to change the world and the resurrection is a gap. It's this interstitial. It's this moment. And to me, I've always found that moment fascinating.
Mm.
And I think that's a moment that Zen tries to approach.
Mm.
And I think within certain Christian thought, one tries to approach that idea. So I realize I'm getting to the point where I'm playing with Christian ideas and Buddhist ideas simultaneously and finding these overlaps and these ways one can feed the other and educate the other, inform the other. And anybody know who Reza Aslan is? I think that's how you say his name. He wrote Zealot, a book about Jesus. His story was great. He had been raised, he'd been born Islamic, became an evangelical Christian in California. And if you know anything about California evangelicals, it's crazy, fascinating stuff, right? Ends up going to college, is at a Jesuit university. And a Jesuit professor says to him, I've always had affection for the Jesuits, said to him, "Why are you Christian?" And he's like, "Well, what do you mean? Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior." You know, I said, "No. Does Islamic stories are your stories? They're the ones you were raised on. They're the ones you know better than any other. Why are you here and not there?" And I heard that story. I heard him tell that story while I was at this point of integrating these different ideas. And it dawned on me, oh, crap. These Lutheran stories are my stories. I used to raise my hand in church. I love these stories. And so I bounced around. I checked out a couple, and I found a ELCA church, Lutheran church in Douglasville. As I always say, they're the liberal Lutherans, right? And I went there. And it was funny because it's been 40 years since I've been inside a Lutheran church. And it felt like me. This is what had created me. But it was different now. And this isn't directly answering your question, but I think it's relevant to this. Zen is a liturgical practice.
How do you mean?
Zen, there is a set of practices, rituals that one engages in that are the function of which is for you and your faith to interact, to connect, and you and your community to participate in together.
I see that as experiential, and liturgical I think of as, the sort of written word. Is it?
Yeah, I think that's how oftentimes people think of it, but I think that liturgy too often is seen as dogma or doctrine. But I think liturgy is the practice. Liturgy is practice. But I think when one grows up in a faith, as I had in Lutheranism, it's just what the world looks like. Leaves are green, tree bark is brown, water is blue. It's just what it is. You don't think about it. Well, here I was, newly sober, fragile as can be, and I'm thrown into this seriously ritualized liturgical world. And I'm asked to take care of the Zendo with no instruction. And so I'm studying everything. I'm watching every move. I still have notebooks. This whole thing, I have sketches of where everything goes. And I learned to look at the liturgy and the practice of faith. That's what Zen taught me more than anything else, is the practice of faith. And for me, it's the heart of faith. So now I go back to the Lutheran Church, and suddenly I see it. I'd never seen it before. I could see the liturgy not as the thing I had to sit through as a kid, you know, and draw airplanes. I used to draw airplanes on the programs and Army men, and I carefully ripped them out. We'd have whole little wars there next to me. But now I saw what it was, or at least what it can be. And it was beautiful. And that's what brought me back.
So Voices of Faith, talk about that. And I know Sensei is going to be one of the interviewees, right? We've
invited Sensei. After having caused trouble here for a number of years, I've somehow garnered permission to cause trouble at Good Shepherd, the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd in Douglasville. And I've been given permission. Again, how people trust me is beyond me. It's a 6-part series, once a month for 6 months. I'm inviting people from different faith traditions, different backgrounds, different experiences. My goal is kind of what I just described there. What I try to describe is sort of how I experience a practice of faith. I want people to come and share that. For me right now, where I'm at, that's all I care about, is the experience of the practice. Because I think that's true with Zen. The experience of the practice is all you need. And so I've invited different people. My first one, well, I was sitting there one night and like, I gotta find 6 people. How am I going to get 6 people? And I thought of Sensei immediately. I thought, well, he owes me. And I said, I could probably get him. That'd be good. Get the Buddhist in there. That'd be groovy. And I'm running down different ideas. And there's a podcaster who was probably one of the first podcasters of this, what I call post-evangelical movement, that I had listened to and I really dug. And I thought, you know, I'm actually friends with him on Facebook because I'm a geek. And I said, oh, you're somebody I listen to. Mm-hmm. Friends. And so I sent him a message one night and said, hey, I'm doing this. Are you interested? And he responded with his phone number, said, call me. And I booked him that night.
This is John Scott.
John Scott. He's the
podcaster pastor.
Podcaster pastor. He's a former evangelical. Now he's a pastor at Unity in Chattanooga.
Okay.
And he has the Holy Heretics podcast.
Holy Heretics. What a great name.
It's fantastic. Him and a buddy of his, who was also a former evangelical preacher, both of them, who had sort of lost their faith, had come to the end of that road, and were battle scarred for it, and started this podcast to kind of deal with that. And the co-host has since left, but it's on its 4th season now. It just started again, and it's been wonderful to see somebody in a shattered faith reconstructed. Mm-hmm. And so he's terrific. He's also a musician, so he's going to speak. I'm going to do a little interview with him, and then he's going to play some music. So
and that's Sunday, May 19th. I'm going to try to come to that.
May 19th, 6 o'clock in Douglasville. Mm-hmm. The next month, Sensei's coming. Now he knows what I expect of him. I want something personal and honest and heretical, and then a little interview. And everybody who's a musician, I'm saying you got to play some music. You got to do a song or two at the end.
Excellent.
I'm going to have somebody from the big mosque here in Atlanta come. I have, because I think this is funny, a pastor that I met before who was a former Lutheran, is now a Baptist preacher at a predominantly Black church. One of my later people is going to be somebody who was a former Baptist from a fairly important Baptist preacher family who is now Lutheran, and he's Black. And so a Black Lutheran pastor in what is probably the whitest denomination in America. So we're trying to, I have somebody who she and her wife co-pastor a church in Carrollton. We're trying to get as many different, as much as I could find, experiences and ideas.
That's great.
And we're going to do this. We're gonna do this. We're gonna sit
Let's
and
have a
talk
conversation. So you're great at conversation and you're great at telling stories, and I know you like to write. Talk to us as we kind of pull this together. Talk to us about your writing practice, and I'd love it if you could tell our audience and listeners about Nezumi the Temple Mouse.
So while I was doing all my crazy stuff here, I got really annoyed at people because it was my experience that if I or anybody else said something, made some statement, everyone would be like, whatever. But if you went, oh, Dogen said it, everyone would be like, oh, man, that's deep. I'm in. So I started writing fake stories as in the style of these old stories that we all read, right?
Like fake koan, like made up koans.
Yeah, exactly. So I invented one. And the main character is Nezumi, and the other main character is the blind master. And really, what I was doing is each one of these kind of centered around one of the no intoxicants, the vows, right? Precepts. Thank you. Couldn't think of the word. Around each of the precepts, discussing them. But because that was enough for me, I needed to have jokes that only I got. Nezumi is a Japanese word for mouse. So it's a little ambiguous as to whether or not it's actually a person or a mouse, kind of magical realism. Or maybe the blind master is just nuts and he's imagining it all. But that wasn't good enough. So I've come up with, I love Soren Kierkegaard, philosopher Kierkegaard. One thing Kierkegaard would do is he would write something and he would get it published. And then he would write a response to it under another name and get that published. And I always thought that was great. So I started writing fake scholarly commentary on my fake historical stories. And I'm almost sorry to be telling the story because I really wanted to pass them off here and see if anybody caught them. But one of the commentaries is actually named Kurt Gardner because I'm funny. But that's some of my Kierkegaard, Kurt Gardner.
Like we were talking about who is Chance the Gardener from Being There.
Yeah, which is a play on that. So I've been writing those. I wrote those for a while. Then actually when I started attending the Lutheran Church, I did a project at Lent. I each week for Lent would view a different film on the story of Christ. And I would write an article about its portrayal, and which was fascinating because you had like Zeffirelli's blue-eyed Jesus who's so sweet, and then you got like Pasolini, this old Italian director, who is this deeply existentialist, and then for me in my own writing, Harlan Ellison, one of my favorite authors, love Harlan Ellison. He died while I was on vacation with my daughter, and I'm reached that age now where like all my heroes, not only have they died, but everyone's forgotten who they are, which sucks, And I thought, I hate that Harlan Ellison is about to be forgotten. So I thought, I've never really written fiction much. I'm going to write a short story every day, 1,500 words or more for the 10 days I'm on vacation to see if I could do it. And I did it. And I've fallen in love with writing short stories, and I've been doing that ever since.
So just bring it back, Temple Mouse.
Temple Mouse.
What is this Temple Mouse?
I ramble, don't I?
No, that was good. That was good. Temple Mouse. Give us an example of what Temple Mouse does. Give us some of Temple Mouse's wisdom. What can we learn?
I don't know if I can give much wisdom. I remember there.
Does it have to do with cheese? I'm just thinking of Temple Mouse. I don't know what they.
Oh well, actually, it's funny because almost all the stories, Temple Mouse is eating the crumbs left over. which I think is probably a metaphor for how, and Temple Mouse really is a metaphor for how I felt in the Zendo, is, especially when I'm coming down and cleaning before anybody gets there, and everyone leaves in the night clean again, and, and usually they'd be dialogues like, I remember the one about intoxicants. The blind master is saying to Nizami, Nizumi, why aren't you at the party? All the students are at this party drinking, having a good time, and they're kind of having a discussion about whether he should go or not. Not in that like,
And
son, it's not that kind of thing.
This is the blind master who doesn't know whether this is a mouse or a man.
I don't know if the blind master knows if it is or not. He might.
You're not sure.
I don't answer that question.
All right, that's fair.
I'd rather be surprised. But yeah, there's a way in which maybe the blind master is just sitting there contemplating the vow and thinking about it in these terms. And here's the squeak of a mouse, and he's imagining a conversation. Or maybe the mouse is actually a person. It's saying, I don't know if I should go. They're being loud and boisterous, and it's kind of stupid, but it's about community and things like that. They're not funny. Like I said, a lot of them are me kind of just poking fun at the conventions of Zen. They're both trying to convey my thoughts on the precepts, but also poking fun at. Yeah. Actually, another one. There's another master who comes and visits, and poke fun at the way everybody responds to this guy now. And Izumi being like, so this is the big dude now? We're supposed to listen to him?
Well, one of the things, Kevin, that I get out of Zen is the fact that the practice itself is a way to disrupt the sort of normal flow of or traditional or maybe conditioned flow of thought. And in that disruption, there's a pause. I don't know if it's the Saturday between the Friday and the Sunday or what that pause is. But it strikes me that you're somebody that really embodies that and really lives that. You've really wrestled with that, and in your writing too, it's embodied. The idea of a temple mouse and all the what you've set up in that situation is one which is in a maybe not comical, but a gently kind of absurdist way. And so I look forward to reading those. And I know we're at the end of our time, but I wanted to say thank you for being here.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. This, as you can tell, all you have to do is go tell a story, and I'll tell
turn
one.
them out. Go.
I appreciate it. This has been great.
That's really great. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you all. Do you have questions for Kevin? Anything before we wrap? Yeah.
Oh, he wrote it down.
Have to.
This is not good.
My head is a sieve. So I had a bit of a stop when you talked about liturgy, because as a Quaker, we have a very structured formlessness. And in theology, when I studied theology, we called that not liturgy, what's called null liturgy. In the same way that a cup without the space in the middle of the cup can't exist, a classic Zen concept, that in Quakerism, you have null liturgy. There's no, just like in Zen, there's, aside from chanting, there's very little, as I understand, liturgical practice per se. There are forms. I think of Tibetan Buddhism as liturgical, but Zen is null liturgy. So I was wondering if you were unfamiliar with that, whether that resonated with you. The absence of liturgy is itself liturgical, but it's null liturgy. It's a theological, philosophy.
Yeah, and I wish thank you. And I think you're likely far more versed in the language than I am. And so and you're right, when I'm using it in a somewhat colloquial, but also completely made up way. I mean, I spent a lot of time lately on this idea of liturgy. To me, this is kind of probably my focus right now is the idea of liturgy. Yeah, no liturgy. Yes, I get it. It makes sense, but it's still the same thing to me. In that we can say, there's liturgy with these, 144 rules. There's liturgy with nothing. It's still, the point is not the rules, the number of rules, but that it is that practice which is meant to connect oneself with the divine, whatever you want to describe it, and I'll say, and one another, or we could say, and therefore one another, or and thus one another, or all the different ways. Can we break it down into liturgy, no liturgy? Yes. There's probably a lot of great fruit we can get from that. It's not my gig. But then again, this is something I'm just beginning to really explore.
Others? Anybody online? Yeah.
Kevin, you said two things that really struck me, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about them. One, you talked about Taoism and the way, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about the flow as opposed to the way, in terms of just how the Mississippi changes every day, and it's a different Mississippi, and that's different from a path which we think of as something that is liturgical. So that the second one was even more interesting, and which I really liked, was you used the word ceremony before you used the word liturgical. That is, life. What was meaningful for you, you said, when you went back and looked at the integration of Lutheranism or Christianity and Buddhism, Taoism, and philosophy, that there's something about that ceremony, a ceremony, where you stop and enter into something that is created for the purpose of not knowing and just existing on faith. I guess my question is, does that make sense to you, what I'm saying? Because what you made sense, it made sense what you were saying to me.
And I only want to stop you because I don't want to lose it, because I almost don't want to say anything because you've said it very beautifully. Yes. And I think about that in my time tending the Zendo. I always think I was always a terrible Buddhist, because for me, the sitting part was great and I could do it, pretty good at it. But what I always got the most from was when I would come in and I would change the flowers and I would clean the incense and I would go through and brush every cushion and fluff them, and I would make sure things. And I had to say, I read that this should be the practice. I don't know if it is, but when I finished cleaning the Zendo, the last thing I did would be to wipe down the threshold. And then at the end, it's the last thing I would do. This, yes, because it is all, I agree. It's what I love, is the entry into the divine. The entry into, and I would say it, and I forget, you used the phrase, I wasn't thrilled with at the end of it, but I would phrase it as, practice is about entry into and participation with the divine. I'm using divine for lack of a better, use whatever word you want, use it as a placekeeper, I don't care. But to me right now, it's the word that kind of feels right on my tongue. Does that address?
Others? Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for our audience being here, and we hope you will join us again next Thursday for ZENtalk.
So dangerous to tell me to talk. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
That was
Thank you.
Nobody says you're
Well done.